In this video, we are going to discuss an attacking concept known as the Rook Lift. This is a very important attacking concept that can be used in many different situations, so it's well worth knowing about. We'll start off with a very simplified example where I've just left the major pieces on the board. Here in this position it's white to play. His queen is nicely centralized and it's putting pressure on the h7 pawn. If white wanted to put more pressure on this pawn, he could use his rooks to help him out. So for example, he could try rook e3 to h3. And this would attack the pawn and force black to create some weakness in his king side. He could also do the same with his other rook c1 to c3 and over to h3 as well. In some positions the rook might go to g3, and then white could use his queen to attack g7 and try to force a weakening that way. But the main point is to force your opponent to make weakening pawn moves in his king's position. So for example, let's say white plays rook e3 and say black plays queen d7. Then after rook h3, the h7 pawn is under fire and black has to make an unenviable choice. He has to decide which way he's going to weaken his position. And this will depend on what other minor pieces white has on the board at a particular moment. So for example, if black plays h6, this could be dangerous if white still has a light squared bishop, and he can play bishop d3 and threaten to checkmate on h7 with his queen. In that case, black would find it very difficult to defend against this unless he has a knight that can come to f6. For example, if black played g6 in response to bishop d3, then the h6 pawn would be weak and may drop off. Or if black played f5, then his e6 pawn could be very weak as well. So it just depends on what pieces each side has left. If white had a dark squared bishop, for example, if he plays rook g3 here, then he's putting pressure on g7, and also, since this pawn is pinned, the h6 pawn could be weak as well. So if he had a bishop on d2, for example, he might be already threatening to take. Or he could follow up with, say, queen g4 or queen e5. Again, threatening mate in both cases. This could be quite dangerous for black, and it all depends on what pieces white has left. Again, if black plays g6, then white could try, say, queen f4 to h6, as this square is now weak, and then the h7 pawn will be under fire as well. If white had a dark squared bishop, indeed, he could play bishop h6 too, and after queen e5, black would be facing a lot of threats on g7. So this is a very dangerous attacking maneuver, and it all depends on the specific situation, and depends on which pieces both sides have left as to how black will deal with it. In this position, with only major pieces left, after rook e3, the drawback of this move is that white has weakened the back rank, and his king in particular is quite weak on g1. And the reason the king is going to remain weak is that if white pushes a pawn to give his king some luft, then he will block off his rook's access along the third rank to the king side, which sort of ruins the whole idea of rook e3. So for example, if he plays h3 in this position, then the rook can never swing across to h3. And if he plays g3, then the rook just can't access the king side at all. The pawn's in the way. So normally pushing the pawns to the fourth rank is going to be too dangerous as well. So here, if white plays rook e3, then a simple way for black to deal with it in this situation is to play rook c8. And this would give him plenty of counterplay. Here, he targets the weak back rank immediately, and white has no time to set up an attack on the king side. If white moves his rook, then black can even just double like this, and rook c1, and again he'll take advantage of the weak back rank. So those are the drawbacks and the advantages of the rook lift idea. Oftentimes it happens on the third rank, sometimes it happens on the fourth rank. We'll see some examples of that as well. But in our first game we're going to take a quick look at how the rook lift can work to perfection. So it was the decisive straightening of the attack. So we'll take a look at that game now. So this game is an old game of mine from the 2006 Irish Championship. I was playing a club mate of mine, Bernard Boyle, who's rated between 1800 and 2000, so he's a strong club player, and around this time I was rated close to 2100. The game started off with e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, e5, and already we can see how this is an aggressive system for white, how he's already putting pressure on the knight in f6, and how he's already got his eye on the black king, as the e5 pawn covers the f6 square and prevents the knight from staying there. And normally on f6 the knight is a very good defender of the king side, so if this knight moves and black castles, h7 in particular could be weak. Here Bernard played knight e4, which was a pet line of his for a long time, and in fact he played so many games with this that even Alexander Halifman noticed it and put it in his famous opening for white according to Anand series, so one of his games appeared in that. Unfortunately this line is just quite dubious, and I think these days with modern computers it can be considered to be almost completely refuted. But we had a few interesting games in this line before that was discovered. So here the critical test is to play knight takes e4, d takes, and Black's plan is to put pressure on the d4 pawn by playing c5. He's trying to use the fact that his queen is quite active on d8 already, but the drawback is that the e4 pawn is very weak. So white has to prevent black from playing c5, and the old way of doing this was to play bishop e3. But this doesn't really work so well. I think it's quite unclear. Black can play c5, and if d takes, then queen c7. And I remember this being not particularly clear or not particularly good for white. So at the time, because he kept playing this against me, I had to find some way to deal with this, and I came across the move bishop c4. And this move is a lot stronger. The point is to meet c5 with d5. And here, this puts pressure on e6, and the e4 pawn is also very weak. If black takes on d5, white could take with either queen or bishop, but bishop takes in particular threatens both the e4 pawn, and it threatens to take on f7 check. And the queen on d8 would be under fire then too. So Bernard's way of dealing with this was to play knight d7. And this is a sensible idea. The point is to prevent white from playing d5 altogether, and black will follow up with c5. The only issue is that it is a defensive idea, as when black plays c5, he would much rather have his knight on b8 so that he can come to c6 and put pressure on d4 as well. So here the knight just isn't that well placed on d7, and white doesn't have much to worry about. So I just continue developing. c3 reinforces the d-pawn, and after c5, white played knight e2. And now black has a choice. He can take the d4 pawn, or he can play knight b6. In the game, Bernard took the pawn. Knight b6 has been played against him before by, I think, international master Mark Heidenfeld in a rapid game. And I don't think it's a much better choice. I think it's basically the same kind of idea. After bishop b3, black plays bishop d7, and he may regret not taking on d4 soon. So I looked at this recently again with the computer just to see what it says these days, and I found some improvements for white. So after castles, black plays bishop c6, white plays bishop e3, threatening to take the c5 pawn. And here it's already a little too late for black to take on d4. If he does, white takes back with the knight this time. And now the bishop on c6 is under fire. White will play queen g4, putting pressure on g7 and putting pressure on e4. And his rook can come to the d-file very quickly. So black's under a lot of pressure here. So if black tries to play without taking on d4 and tries knight d5, my original notes to this game from 14 years ago, I said that knight g3 was the strongest move. And this puts pressure on e4, and indeed it is very good for white. However, there is an even better way, so I'd like you to pause your videos and have a think about this. What can white do? Well, he picks a very unstereotypical decision, and he gives up his light square bishop for the knight on d5. And the whole point is that the c5 pawn is very weak. So I found this quite surprising. After, say, e takes d5, black just loses a clear pawn. And with d5 weak, and the d4 square for the knight, white is much better despite black's bishop pair. So instead, black should take with the queen, trying to keep an eye on c5. But after knight f4, the queen must retreat. And then after d takes c5, black is a pawn down, and he's going to struggle to regain it. And even when he does, white will gain a lot of time. So after queen c7, here the best idea is just to give up the e5 pawn and start rolling with white's massive queenside majority. He has 4 against 2 on the queenside, and this is going to be very strong for black. So I think that this is a useful line to look at. It's a good illustrative line. It's a little bit far removed from our theme, but hopefully you'll pick up other middle game themes from this, such as how to use a queenside pawn majority and how to punish kind of time wasting opening play by your opponent. So here, if white plays b4, black plays queen takes e5, so he's attacking the c pawn, and white just ignores it and plays a4. So in this case, white is just going to roll black over with b5. So black hasn't really got time to take the pawn. He plays bishop e7. And let's say white plays b5, attacking the bishop, bishop d5, and now white can just simplify. He can play knight takes, queen takes, e takes. Then he brings the rook into the game with rook fd1, and if black plays rook d8, then white can just play a5. And I think we can stop here. White is threatening to play a6. The c5 pawn is incredibly strong, and black's a7 pawn is going to be very weak. And white is just completely winning. And it's amazing that he has such a huge advantage on the queen side. So despite the fact that black started off this line with 2 bishops and an extra center pawn, say here, white's queenside pawns are just so strong that black gets rolled over. So I just thought that was a very interesting line, and I thought I'd include it anyway, even though it's a little bit far away from our theme. So instead of knight b6, black took on d4, so immediately trying to avoid all this queenside pawn majority stuff that white had in the previous line. And white could take with the queen on d4, and in my old notes I said that after queen a5, bishop f4, white is better because of the weak e4 pawn. And this is true, But in fact, black has a much better idea. He can play queen c7 first instead, and then after bishop f4, he's ready to play b6. And here, if white takes on e4, then black can play bishop b7, and the g2 pawn is hanging, as well as the queen on e4. So that's not so strong. Instead, white should try and play knight g3, trying to win the pawn back. But now black has a very interesting move, e3. And this is a nice disrupting move for black. Both white's queen and bishop are tied to the e5 pawn, so it's not so easy for him to gain that back. He can't really take on e3 with either one of those pieces. And the c4 bishop is undefended as well. It's only protected by the queen on d4. So here, white has to take with the f pawn on e3, and then after bishop c5, and say followed up with bishop b7, black has excellent compensation for the pawn, and the whole thing is just very unclear. So I actually don't think queen takes d4 is that interesting anymore. The most natural was c takes d4, which is what I played, and I think it's just best. And now black plays bishop b4 check. And at the time, I didn't think this move was that good, because after, say, bishop d2, which is what I played, the d6 square is going to be very weak in black's camp. But it does give him a tempo to get castles quickly. So I don't think it's that bad. In fact, instead of bishop d2, knight c3 seems to be a stronger move for white, just immediately putting pressure on e4. And again, I want to give an illustrative line here because I think it's quite a nice example of white's attacking chances. If black just castles here, then after white castles, the e-pawn is just going to fall off very soon. Instead, black can try to take advantage of the pin of the knight on c3 by playing knight b6. And after bishop b3, knight d5. And this starts to look like an old Morphy game where black has wasted a lot of time trying to move his knight around to attack the knight on c3. And unfortunately for him, he spends so much time doing this, and all he gains is a pawn, that white can just castle and ignore it altogether. And after knight takes c3, b takes, bishop takes, again we can see that this diagonal is very weak. Black's king is stuck in the center, and because the bishop is on c3, the g7 pawn is also undefended. So I can immediately start putting pressure on this. He can just play queen g4 and ignore the attack on the rook. So again, I very much like this illustrative line, so we're going to have a look at it. After queen g4, again the pawn on g7 is attacked. If black plays bishop takes a1, then we take on g7. And black has a couple of options here, but none of them are very good. So if he plays rook f8, then bishop a3 just picks up the rook and attacks the bishop on a1. And with black's king in the center, you can just see he's going to get torn apart. So instead of this, black should try king d7. He tries to run away with his king, but after bishop a3, you can see how this bishop on a1 is missing from the defense of all the dark squares, and white is threatening to take on f7. So black plays king c7, just trying to shuttle out of the way, and then we can play rook takes a1, and if bishop d7, black desperately trying to complete his development, white can play bishop d6 check, king b6, and with this king on b6, after queen takes f7, black won't survive for very long. So we can play rook b1 next, and the king is just too exposed for this to work. And notice how strong this bishop is on d6. It cuts the communication between black's rooks, and his queen hasn't managed to leave the back rank yet. So this is just winning for white. And if we go back a little bit after bishop a3, instead of king c7, black could try and challenge white's queen with queen g8, and this also defends the f-pawn. But after queen f6, white is taking aim at the dark squares, and black can play queen d8 to defend again, but now we take on f7 check, and after king c6, rook takes a1. White is only in exchange for a pawn down, and black's king is just far too exposed. The two bishops are incredibly strong, especially the dark squared one, and rook c1 check will finish the game very quickly. So again, I thought this was a nice illustrative line. If black doesn't take the rook on a1, and tries instead to play queen takes d4, this was the computer's main line, we'll start to see some other attacking themes in this position as well. So after queen takes g7, attacking the rook on h8, black can defend with queen takes e5, but this is actually a pretty flimsy defense. I'd like you to pause and think about how white might continue the attack here. So black's queen is defending the rook on h8 and also the bishop on c3, but his king is stuck in the center. So you always have to look for checks. White's next check is incredibly strong. He can play bishop a4 check. And I really like this move. It just sort of pops out and attacks the king on e8. And black really doesn't have a choice here. If he plays king e7, his king is very exposed on the dark squares, and white can either play bishop a3 check, or he can play bishop g5 check, in either case with a winning attack. So instead, black needs to try b5. And here we can play bishop takes b5 check, queen takes, and queen takes c3. And this brings up another point, so another attacking theme which we'll see later in this series with opposite colored bishops. So attacking with opposite colored bishops always favors the attacker because you're attacking on the dark squares, and black only has a light square bishop which can only defend along the light squares. So black is basically a piece down on the side where he's being attacked. And this means he just hasn't got enough defense. So you notice that black's dark squares look like Swiss cheese. There are just so many holes, and this bishop can attack from g5, from b2, from a3. There are so many squares that black is vulnerable on. So if black plays, say, rook g8 here, just to get his rook off breeze, then white is another fantastic move. And I'd like you to pause and think about this too. So white can play rook b1. This is a fantastic distracting move. Again, we're only giving away pieces that we don't need. This rook wasn't attacking at the moment, so it's useful to use it to lure the black queen away onto a vulnerable square. After queen takes b1, white can play queen c6 check, and it looks like white is just going to win the rook on a8, but in fact he has something even stronger. After king d8, white can play bishop g5 check, now including his other last piece in the attack. So first was the rook on a1, now it's the rook on f1. After rook takes g5, rook takes b1, black is losing his rook on a8 by force, but also in this position his king is just too exposed to survive. So if we imagine that it was even queen against two rooks, in those situations the side with the two rooks, if they have an exposed king, usually finds it very difficult to coordinate. And here, if your king is exposed, the queen can just start checking from all different angles and usually fork either one of the rooks or just win a lot of pawns along the way. So in those situations the queen is no weaker than the two rooks, and here of course white also has an extra exchange, a rook for bishop. So this is just winning for white. So again, I know that was a diversion, but I think there were a few instructive attacking themes there as well. So I think that was also very important. So if we go back to the main game, instead of knight c3 I played bishop d2. And here black took on d2, queen takes, and I thought he should have actually castled here. Doesn't make a big difference, but it does set a little trap for white. If white plays the natural move castles, then because the dark square bishops have been exchanged, black can actually play knight takes e5, exploiting this pin on the d-pawn. So white shouldn't fall for that, and instead should play knight c3, and the game will probably transpose, the line will probably transpose into the game. The e4 pawn is very weak here too. So in the game black played knight b6 instead, and after bishop b3, black played bishop d7, white castled, and now black has some choice. Both castles, which is what he played, and bishop c6 should probably transpose, but he also has bishop b5, which I thought was tempting during the game, but in fact it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. He is trying to pin the knight on e2, but after rook e1, this doesn't really achieve its aim. Black can play bishop d3, trying to block off the defense of the d4 pawn and protect his e-pawn, but after knight c3, white solves both problems. After queen takes d4, white can play knight takes e4, and the bishop on d3 is pinned, the queen on d4 is undefended, knight d6 check is coming next, and black is in a lot of trouble. So this doesn't really work. Instead, after bishop d7 castles, in the game black castles, and after knight c3, the e4 pawn was hanging. Black played bishop c6 to defend it, rook fe1 attacking it again, and now black played bishop d5. And this often happens in this situation, in this line actually. Black often ends up losing his e4 pawn, but he tries to get some compensation for it. So here, I was a young player, I wasn't really confident in my technique, and I felt that I should keep the pieces on and try to attack, as opposed to just winning a safe pawn. So if I play knight takes e4, bishop takes b3, a takes, knight d5, I wasn't really sure about this position. Looking back, white should have more than enough. He has an extra pawn and a better pawn structure as well, a better position. The knight on e4 can come into d6, and that's going to be stronger than the knight on d5. And even though his extra pawn on d4 doesn't look like much, it's not going away. Again, it's a hard decision to make. I didn't feel confident that I was going to be able to win this or be able to have the technique to put my opponent away. But here white also has a positional advantage on top of the extra pawn, so he should really play this. And possibly something like queen d3, and white still has an excellent position and very, very good chances to win. However, in the game I thought that bishop c2 was a stronger idea, just basically playing for the attack. And it's still not a bad practical decision. After knight c4, black is forking the queen and pawn on b2, and here I played queen e2. This probably isn't the strongest way. Instead, white should go queen f4. The queen is a bit more active here, and if black plays in the game with knight takes b2, then after knight takes e4, he's faced with very strong threats. So here his king basically has no defenders left, and we put the pawn on e5 ages ago, but now it's a very, very strong attacking force, and black is already faced with a knight f6 check sacrifice. And we won't go through this just yet because a similar theme will crop up in the game. We look at the variations there, but here it's very similar. Black is going to be in a lot of trouble. So black must take on e4, and after queen takes e4, he's faced with mate on h7. So here the bishop on c2 does the job of the rook lift in our previous example, forcing black to create a weakness in his king side. He must play g6. And now after this, the simplest way to play is bishop b3. And just comparing the minor pieces in this position, even if black's knight on b2 can rescue itself, we can see how much stronger the bishop on b3 actually is. White is going to follow up with d5, and after he takes, the next move he's going to play after he takes back is to play e6. And the diagonals towards black's king are going to be blown open, and black's just he's going to get torn apart. So queen f4 was a very strong move. Instead I played queen e2, and after knight takes b2, I just played knight takes e4. And this is the critical moment of the game. Black's pieces aren't coordinating so well. His bishop on d5 is very strong. White has a slightly weaker structure with the pawn on d4, but black's knight on b2 is out of play. He should probably try and bring that knight back in immediately with knight c4. White still has attacking chances. He can play, for example, queen g4, which again threatens knight f6 check and feeds more pieces over to the king side. Or he can play rook a d1, possibly thinking of playing rook d3 and swinging the rook across this way, the rook lift that we talked about. If he tries rook a b1, he sets an interesting trap for black that's easy enough to fall into. Here it's very, very important that black leaves his knight on c4, and we'll see why in a second. Rook c8 is the strongest move, and this knight now covers a very important square on d6, stopping knight d6 attacking the rook. It also does something else very important, and we'll see what that is now. If black is tempted to try and fork these two by playing knight a3, this would be a great idea if he succeeded in swapping off the light square bishop on c2. However, white has a really strong idea here. See if you can pause your video and calculate it out. Well, white can play knight f6 check, and this was the theme we talked about a few moves ago. Black must take, and now white can sacrifice again. Bishop takes h7 check, and black is going to get mated on the open files towards his king. If he plays king takes h7, we have a very typical idea: queen h5 check, queen g4 check, which is very precise usually, just forcing the king to the h file. And now, because this knight on a3 is no longer covering the e3 square from c4, white can play rook e3. And this is our rook lift. The rook comes across to h3 with devastating effect. The king just can't be defended. So it's of the utmost importance that black leaves his knight on c4. Unfortunately for him, knight a3 doesn't work, but rook c8 is pretty good and leaves black still in the game. So instead, I think my opponent spotted all these sort of tricks and threats and saw that the h7 square was very vulnerable. However, the way he chose to defend it wasn't so good. He played queen h4, and unfortunately this is a losing blunder. It looks like a kind of a pseudo-active move. He's putting pressure on the knight on e4, trying to stop it from moving because the d4 pawn is hanging, and he's also giving added protection to h7. However, the queen is very exposed on h4. So, how can white take advantage of the exposed queen on h4? And bearing in mind the theme of this chapter, what do you think you should play? Well, trying to include all your pieces in the attack is usually a very, very good idea. That's another theme that crops up a lot. So here, if we are trying to engineer a rook lift, well, trying to play rook e3 is not so easy because our queen has to move. It's not so efficient. Our queen is already well placed. The main piece that hasn't been moved is the rook on a1. And if we can bring this into the game, then it's going to be very strong. So we should play rook a b1, attacking the knight on b2. This gains time. And after knight c4, now we can use the idea of a rook lift. Here, the knight blocks out the bishop on d5 from covering b3. So we can play rook b3, threatening rook h3. And this is the key maneuver. If you were not aware of the rook lift concept, then you might get just stuck here. You think, oh, the queen's annoying here, how do I kick it? But you can't really find a way to do it. If you know about the rook lift and you know about including all your pieces in the attack, this move becomes much more natural. Rook b3. And now black is totally lost. Unfortunately, he hasn't got a defense, and we'll see a lot of nice attacking themes over the next few moves. In the game, black played h6. I've looked at a few other moves. If he plays rook fd8 instead, trying to give his king an escape square, then after rook h3, queen e7, white can show yet another idea of the rook lift. If we haven't succeeded in forcing a weakening of the opponent's pawn structure, we can instead just destroy it and sacrifice the rook. So here, white should play rook takes h7. And the point is that after king takes h7, white will play knight f6, double check. And now it doesn't matter that the king has escaped squares because he can't access them. The knight is covering the g8 square. So the king is forced to stay on the h-file, and after king h8, queen h5 is mate, and the same can be said for king h6, queen h5 mate as well. So this just doesn't work for black. Instead, he could play rook fc8, again with the same idea. After rook h3, he can put the queen on d8, and now the king is threatening to sort of run out to e7 at some point. But yet again, rook takes h7 wins, and the point is, after king takes, knight f6 check, the king can't come back to g8. So instead, after king takes h7, white can play knight f6 check, and the king just can't come out. He's stuck, and again, we'll just win the same way after queen h5 mate. Instead, black could also try queen e7 immediately, just getting out of the way of the rook. Now, rook h3 would give black a couple of options. He could play h6 and transpose to the game, but there's a much more forcing way to win the game. And we've seen this theme before as well. Here, with the rook already on b3, white can play knight f6 check, attacking the king. And after g takes, again we have bishop takes h7 check. And here, now that the rook is already to join in the attack, black just gets mated in no time. In order to prolong the game, he must play king h8. But now, after queen h5, we're threatening a discovery with the bishop, and queen h7 mate. And black's only way to keep the game going is to play rook g8, but it doesn't last very long. Everything is going to be check, 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 and then mate. So bishop e4, check, king g7, rook g3, check. And after king f8, we have mate. Rook takes, check, and check on h8, and that's mate. So again, I know these seem like a lot of kind of complicated variations, but it's every single move is a check, and it's all very forcing and easy to calculate. So the more times you've seen these patterns, the easier it'll be for you to figure them out over the board. In the game, we had a similar finish where after h6, white played rook h3, and after queen e7, again we're going to see this knight f6 check. So here black just simply can't take. If he does, queen g4 is check, and because the bishop covers h7, the black king can't come to defend the h6 pawn, so in the next move we'll just play rook takes h6 mate. So black must play king h8, and this gives white a choice of checkmates in 4 moves. So I picked the flashiest way. I still think it's a good idea. Queen d3 is simpler. It threatens mate on h7, and in order to prolong the game, black has to play bishop e4, but after queen takes, once black plays g6, we just follow up with rook takes h6 check, king g7, and rook h7 mate. In the game, however, I picked a flashier way. See if you can spot it. White plays rook takes h6 check, and after g takes, black is no longer able to block this diagonal. So after queen d3, white mates in a couple of moves. Queen h7 mate. So again, this game showed the Rook Lift idea to perfection. It just worked very well, and that was just because of black's unfortunate queen h4 move, leaving the queen a target for the rook to attack. If instead he had played knight c4, the game would have gone on a bit longer, and yes, white still has attacking chances, but nothing decisive yet. Whereas in the game, this rook ab1 and rook b3 maneuver was immediately decisive. So I hope you enjoyed that and have a good idea of how to employ rook lifts in your games now.